Hello again. In the earlier videos, we talked about charity being Christ to man. We talked about living by the intent of the heart. We looked at the word faith and saw that modern Christianity has a different understanding of this concept of faith because of the evolution of the change in the word from a verb, which meant to commit to, and was related to a covenant commitment with God, and intellectual assent, which is the modern understanding. Belief took on a whole different understanding. It took on obedience to the faith and a covenant relationship with God. We saw that the promise of Abraham fulfilled his entrance into God's church, which is the reestablished kingdom of heaven. When Peter says, when Christ says, your faith has saved you, and some of these times he was actually talking to the Jews who were living under Mosaic law and simply needed faith to complete their faith. So even in that, we show the action of faith. I want to read a verse to you as we move on. Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law, being made a curse for us, for it is written, cursed is everyone that hangeth on a tree. We cannot simply say faith good, law bad. Now, if Christ says, if you love me, you will keep my commandments, then obviously Paul, in talking about the curse of the law, is not talking about 10 commandments. He's not talking about the moral law that all Christians are called to live in. What happened in the Garden of Eden was that it comes down to ego. Man separated from God through his own ego, his own desire that he thinks that he has any kind of worth whatsoever without God. And the church was established in humility, in a sacramental life, to bring us back to the garden. So this process of obedience to the faith is a step toward bringing us back to the garden in humility, and humility's gift is wisdom. After 1,500 years of Christianity, the concept of sola fide was created and sola scriptura. And in this concept of sola fide came the evolution of the false understanding of the word faith. So when it comes to this law, we must really define what Paul meant by we're not under the works of the law, and the law is a curse. If you look at what happened to the Israelites as they left Egypt, they were given the 10 commandments, then they sacrificed to the golden calf. They created their Baal. Baal is one who lords over you. So they chose this idol to lord over them. And then God gave them the second legislation. Now, the second legislation is the pedagogue. A pedagogue is a child's taskmaster. Paul says that the Jews were under this pedagogue. We are no longer under the pedagogue because we are saved by faith. But understand faith as in the active faith when Paul says this. So if we look at the image of the pedagogue and Paul's beautiful discourse on charity, he starts out that by saying that when I was a child, I spoke as a child, I acted like a child. But now that I'm a man, I live in charity. The child is the one who is under the pedagogue. Paul chose charity. which is being Christ a man, over the rules of fear and punishment that are established in seeing the Ten Commandments through simply rule, fear, and punishment, and being under the second legislation of the law, which only Jews were under. Gentiles never made a pact with God. They never made a covenant with God to keep Mosaic law. The law was written on our hearts in charity. So we must define the difference. And this is the biggest difference that created the whole concept of Protestantism. Now, the understanding that I've given you is in opinion, and we can never rise above opinion in our interpretations of Scripture unless we back them up with a faith that was lived. Now, this is what creates disunity. Christ called us to be one as he is one with the Father. So this is the unity and one doctrine we are called to. So if we have opinion arguing with opinion, we get to the point in our fallen nature where we bring ego into it sometimes, because these things cut to the heart. They are, we lived in understanding, and we believe we are living according to God's desire. But sometimes, like I said, God takes us on a journey to higher levels of understanding where we need to continue to live in the faith. So we need to rise above opinion. In the Didascalia Apostolorum, which is the teaching of the 12 apostles, is dated to about 230 AD. Yet a lot of these documents, they're dated, to these dates because things have been added into them. This is a common understanding of historians, that documents can refer to even earlier documents, but when things are added into them, you see the later date. But I'm going to read to you from the Didascalia. Him they denied and said, "We have no God to go before us." And they made them a molten calf and worshipped it, and sacrificed to a graven image. Therefore the Lord was angry, and in his hot anger, yet with the mercy of his goodness, he bound them with the second legislation, and laid heavy burdens upon them, and a hard yoke upon their neck. And he says now no longer, "If thou shalt make as formerly," but he said, "Make an altar and sacrifice continuously, as though he had need of these things." Wherefore he laid upon them continual burnt offerings with a necessity, and caused them to abstain from meats by means of distinctions of meats. For from that time were animals discerned, clean and unclean flesh. From that time were separations and purifications and baptisms and sprinklings. From that time were sacrifices and offerings and tables. From that time were burnt offerings and oblations and showbread, and the offerings of the sacrifices and firstlings and redemptions, and he-goats for sin, and vows, and many other things marvelous. For because of manifold sins there were laid upon them customs unspeakable, but by none of them did they abide, but they again provoked the Lord. For the second legislation was imposed for the making of the calf and for idolatry. But you through baptism have been set free from idolatry and from the second legislation, which was imposed on account of idols. You have been released, for in the gospel he renewed and fulfilled, affirmed the law, but the second legislation he abolished. So when Paul says we are saved by grace through faith, faith living in the covenant with God, grace, baptism is grace given freely. Communion is grace given freely. Confession is grace given freely. Being present in the true Passover of the Holy Mass is grace given freely, where we are sprinkled with the blood that speaks better than that of Abel. Not of works of the second legislation of the Mosaic law, not of works that are done out of rule, fear, and punishment. For we are his workmanship, created in good works, charity, which fulfills the law, provided that we walk in them. God bless.